Okay, good evening, everyone. Welcome to this special event, a tribute to Professor George Bournoutian, one of our senior scholars in the field of Armenian studies. Today, we're going to honor Professor George Bournoutian. My name is Bedross Matossian. I'm the president of the Society for Armenian Studies. And in this specific and special event, we're going to award Professor George Bournoutian the Society for Armenian Studies Lifetime Achievement Award in recognition and appreciation for his outstanding service and contribution to the field of Armenian studies. What I'm going to do now is introduce Professor George Bournoutian, his achievements, and then we'll introduce our featured speakers who are going to talk about Bournoutian's contribution to the field of Armenian studies. Professor George Bournoutian was born in Isfahan, Iran. He's an Iranian-American professor, historian, and author of Armenian descent. He's retired professor of history and author of over 30 books, particularly focusing on Armenian history, Iran, and the Caucasus. He has taught Iranian history at UCLA and Armenian history at Columbia University, Tufts University, New York University, Rutgers University, University of Connecticut, Ramapo College in New Jersey, and Glendale Community College, and Russian and Soviet history at Iona College. Bournoutian is one of the 40 editors of the Encyclopedia Iranica as well. He is fluent in Armenian, Persian, Russian, and Polish, and has a reading command of French. He has accompanied his senior and graduate students on annual trips to Armenia and the Transcaucasia, the Middle East, Africa, Southeast Asia, and Australia, South and Central America, and Antarctica. His books include the latest one is From the Kur to the Aras, a military history of Russia's move into the South Caucasus and the First Russo-Iranian War, 1801-1813, published by Brill, 2020. The other book, published in 2018 by Routledge, called Armenia and Imperial Decline, the Yerevan Province, 1900-1914. In 2016, he published the 1820 Russian survey of the Khanate of Shirvan by the Cambridge Press, and so on. More than 30 books dealing with different aspects of Armenian history in Iran, the Russian Empire, and the Khanate of Armenia. One of his most important books is the History of Modern Armenia, a classical textbook that was translated to Armenian, Farsi, Japanese, Turkish, Russian, Spanish, and Arabic. The list of books is very long. Most of his books have been translated to Farsi first and then other languages. He's currently working on a new project called Roots of Conflict, a demographic and socioeconomic study of the Elizavetpol province in 1908 and the future of Armeno-Azeri territorial disputes. His work is more relevant today in the political crisis and the war that was waged on Artsakh by the Azero-Turkish forces. Now I'm going to introduce our first speaker, Professor Sebouh David Aslanian is a professor of history and Richard Hovhannisyan Chair of Modern Armenian History at UCLA. He is also the inaugural director of the new Armenian Studies Center at UCLA's Promise Armenian Institute. Aslanian specializes in early modern Armenian and global history and is the author of the monograph Dispersion, History, and the Polycentric Nation, the role of Simon Yerevantsi's Girk for Gochi Bardavajar in the 18th century national revival, published in 2014, and the award-winning book From the Indian Ocean to the Mediterranean, the Global Trade Networks of Armenian Merchants from New Julfa, published by California University Press in 2011, which received many prizes. His book, Early Modernity and Mobility, Port Cities, Printers, and the Birth of Confessional Nation Across the Armenian Diaspora, 1512-1800, is forthcoming by Yale University Press, and it's going to be a groundbreaking book. I'm going to give the floor now to Professor Aslanian. Then when we move to Dr. Darbinyan, I'm going to introduce her.
Thank you very much, Bedross, for that very generous introduction. Thank you all for being here. Thank you especially to George Bournoutian for making this event possible. So when my friend Bedross Matossian invited me to give a short talk in honor of George Bournoutian's Lifetime Achievement Award, I was both deeply honored and also very happy to accept the invitation. One moment. So I was happy because I have personally known George for about a dozen or so years and have had familiarity with his prolific body of scholarship for at least 30. If I remember correctly, the first time I heard of George's name and the exciting nature of his scholarship was when I was an undergraduate student many, many years ago at McGill University in Montreal in the late 1980s. So I feel honored today to say a few words because much of George's scholarship has opened wonderful vistas into the period of history that I myself have specialized in over the last good 20 years or so. And one that has all too often been referred to by Armenian historians as, quote, the Dark Ages, or more fittingly, the black hole of Armenian history. I am, of course, referring here to the early modern period, or the Vagh Ardi Shirchan of Armenian and Middle Eastern history. One that stretches from the 16th to the late 18th centuries, during which monumental shifts altered the fundamental structures of both Armenian global as well as Middle Eastern histories. Armenian scholars, on the whole, have all too eagerly, it seems to me, skipped this period, presumably on the basis of the so-called paucity of primary sources. Usually dismissing these crucial centuries in their haste to get to the modern period of the 19th century, when trends of modernization, secularization, and nationalization, industrialization as well, deeply shaped Armenian culture. So over the past several decades, George Bournoutian has done more than any other scholar to spend many years painstakingly isolating and identifying important works, primary sources that shed much light on the nature of this history that unfolds for the Armenians and for their neighbors in the early modern period. So what I'd like to do today is essentially say a few words about this period so that I can then choose and curate a menagerie of 4 texts that George has translated and copiously annotated and introduced, so as to make more sense of their value and importance in the larger period in the larger context of the early modern period in Armenian history. And for that, there's no better place to begin than with this map that I recently commissioned for my next book. And I will invite your attention to this area here of historic Armenia on the Ottoman, Safavid, and Russian South Caucasian triangulation points, where In the late 16th century, approximately 1597 to the early years of the 17th century, what I call two important detonations of forced mobility drove out a significant number of Armenians from their homeland and dispersed them west, south, and east. And in the train of these forced migrations, followed by voluntary mobilities as well, what we witness is the shaping of the early modern period in Armenian history. So the two detonations that I mentioned very quickly are the Jalali rebellions, also known as the Jalali uprisings, that shook the Armenian plateau and eastern Anatolia between 1597 and 1608, and set in motion what Ottoman historians refer to as the Büyük Kaçgın, or the Great Flight. I've taken liberties of translating it provisionally in Armenian as the Medz Pahust, which witnessed the flight of 30, 40, 50, 60,000 Armenians and others, but especially Armenians from the eastern areas of their homeland where they lived into the western sectors of the Ottoman Empire, where many of them settled in Constantinople, Izmir, Rodosto, and other places. The second detonation that set in motion the early modern period is the detonation caused by the Ottoman-Safavid Wars of 1603 to 1618, set in motion by Shah Abbas I, one of the most eminent Safavid rulers, who, as we all know, in his scorched earth policy, warfare against the Ottomans, created what historians refer to as the Büyük Sürgün, that is to say the Medz Darakrutyun, or the Great Deportation, which resulted in 300,000 or so Armenians being forcibly marched and resettled into Iran, where the cream of the crop of that collection ended up settling down with the Shah's consent and patronage in a place called New Julfa, eventually called New Julfa, in memory of their old evacuated town. And this place became the center, the hub of a global network of Armenian settlements, thus also creating the Eastern Armenian diaspora. The Jalalis created the Western Armenian diaspora of Istanbul, Izmir, and further away into the Balkans, as far as the Balkans, and also Crimea and so on. And I'm mentioning all these points because they're actually really related to much of the scholarship that George has created, both in terms of painstakingly accurate translations, as well as very informative commentaries and notes and introductions. Very erudite, I have to say. So I'd like to now move to the first of the menagerie of texts that George has translated, which has really opened up many historians' eyes into this early modern period, not only for Armenian history, but specifically for Ottoman, Iranian, and later on, Russian histories. So the first work I have in mind is a book called The Travel Accounts of Simeon of Poland, which is a translation into English, the first translation into English, if I'm not mistaken, of a work, a traveling diary written by a scholar by the name of Simeon Lehaczy, or Simeon of Poland, who was born in Zamość in Poland in 1584. His parents had migrated there from Kaffa in the Crimea, where many Armenians had settled during the Jalali uprisings as well. Simeon was born in 1584 and is a bibliophile, a copier of manuscripts, and an extremely curious traveler who traveled across the Armenian world, particularly spiritual centers in Eastern Anatolia, Armenia proper, other parts of the Ottoman Empire, Jerusalem, as well as the diaspora in Europe, particularly Venice and other places. I won't go into detail because I will take up too much time, but suffice to say that this is a tremendously important work. And I mention it in the context of the early modern period because I can't think of many other sources that open up unravel, disclose the importance of the Jalali uprisings and forced mobility of tens of thousands of Armenians into the western part of the Ottoman Empire than Simeon's Travelogue. I've spent a great deal of time reading it. In the original, it was first published in a serialized form in Hantes, Amsoria, by the great Mkhitarist scholar and polymath Father Nerses Aghinyan between 1932 and 1936, and published as a separate book in 1936. And you can see an image of it here. It details the havoc, the chaos caused by the Jalalis and the relocation of a kind of intellectual center of gravity of Armenian culture from the homeland to the western parts of the Ottoman Empire, where Western Armenians in the 17th and 18th centuries began to create a uniquely Armenian, Western Armenian culture. Henry Shapiro has written tremendously on this topic, and so I have also discussed it in my own forthcoming book. But suffice to say that this is a very important source, and a number of scholars have used it. And it's the first English translation. It's available in Turkish, in Russian, and other languages. The second source in the menagerie of texts is perhaps the most valuable one in the early modern period, not just for Armenians, but also for others. And it is a text known as the History of Arakel, Vartabet Arakel of Tabriz, published in 2 volumes in 2006, approximately, or together in one omnibus volume, based on the work of an Armenian scholar and celibate priest, archimandrite, known as Arakel Vartabed Tavrizhetzi, born, as the moniker indicates, in Tabriz in the late 1500s, and commissioned to write an account of these chaotic transformations in Armenian history by 2 Catholicoi, first by Catholicos Philippos Arpaketsi in the 1650s, and then soon after Arpaketzi's death, his successor, my favorite Catholicos of all time, Hagop Juhaetzi, reminded him again to pick up his work and to bring it to fruition, and this resulted in this incredible book called Girk Batmutians Sharakreal Vartabedin Arakelo Davrizhetsvo. First printed in 1669, was the first book published while the author first Armenian book printed while the author was still alive. It's published in Amsterdam by Voskani Yerevan's Press. So, and of course, a good chunk of that book, of this work, is devoted to the Jalalis, as well as the Büyük Sürgün of Shah Abbas and the consequences of the fishbone-like dispersion of the Armenians from their homeland to distant locations, where many of them later on became extremely successful cultural producers as well as merchants. Now let me quickly move on to the Russian sphere of George's work. And here I have in mind a book George published in 2001, so quite early, called Armenians and Russia, 1626 to 1796, a documentary record. This is a work that is based on a consultation of approximately 2,000 primary source archival documents in Russian from various archives in Russia, involving Armenians' interactions with the Russians. And anyone who knows the early modern period will tell you that this interaction became increasingly accelerated as the early modern period gathered steam, and as Russia as an empire began to move south into the region. So it's based on several volumes, 4 volumes of Russian translations published in Yerevan from 1953 to as late as 1990. I have the titles here and one of the images of the first edition, which I've looked at because it has Armenian documents as well inside. And then lastly is George's work on Simeon Yerevanzi, the most formidable Armenian Catholicos of the early modern period, someone who was very pivotal in engineering a religious and confessional identity for Armenian nationhood in the late 18th century, and opened the first printing press in Yerevan. In 1765, Simeon Yerevanzi, who reigned from 1763 to 1780, wrote a monumental work called Jamber in Armenian. It's actually based on the French word chambre, which is basically another term for a chamber where archives are kept. And it catalogs the history of Surp Echmiadzin, with all of its dioceses, its rites, jurisdictions, its history and practices. And this work as well was not available in English. It's a multi-100-page volume, translated and published with a very erudite introduction also by George more recently. So it's based on an 1873 publication. So with this, I will conclude by saying that George's scholarship, in my opinion, is absolutely pivotal, both as a translator, he is pivotal, as well as a commentator and historian who sets the documents in their proper context and provides these glosses that are useful to people who read the originals, but often find interesting glosses that, insightful glosses that open up lots of recondite terms in obscure languages and so on. So he has done more than anybody else to bring to life this early modern period and to make it not just accessible to Armenian scholars, but I would say necessary also for non-Armenian scholars, scholars who work on Ottoman history, scholars who work on Safavid history, Qajar history, as well as Russian history. So with that, I will close it. I would like to thank George for this wonderful body of scholarship, and thank you again for everyone, and thank you, Bedross, for doing this.
Thank you, Sebouh. Can you unshare the?
Sure.
Our next speaker is Dr. Asya Darbinyan. She's currently a visiting scholar at Clark University. Between 2019 and 2020, she was a teaching postdoctoral fellow at Stockton University. She completed her PhD in history at the Strassler Center for Holocaust and Genocide Studies, Clark University, in December 2019 under the guidance of Professor Taner Akçam. Her dissertation explores the Russian Empire's responses to the Armenian genocide and to the refugee crisis at the Caucasus battlefront of World War I. Previously, Darbinyan worked at the Armenian Genocide Museum Institute in Yerevan as a senior researcher and deputy director of the museum. Dr. Darbinyan's research and teaching expertise stands at the intersection of Armenian history, the history of the Russian Empire, genocide, refugees, and humanitarian interventions, with a focus on the agency and actions of refugees in addressing their suffering and plight. She's a recipient of multiple scholarships, including the Gulbenkian, Carlos Gulbenkian Scholarship, the Society for Armenian Studies Scholarship, and most recently, the Aurora Humanitarian Initiatives Vartan Grigorian Scholarship. Her book chapter, Humanitarian Crisis at the Ottoman-Russian Border, Russian Imperial Responses to the Armenian Refugees of War and Genocide, 1914-1915, appeared in the edited volume by J. Laycock called Aid to Armenia, Humanitarianism and Intervention from the 1890s to the Present. Her recent article, Recovering the Voices of Armenian Refugees in Transcaucasia, Accounts of Suffering and Survival, appeared in the fall-winter issue of the Armenian Review, Fall-Winter 2020. Floor is yours, Dr. Darbinyan.
Thank you. Thank you, Bedross, for such a generous introduction and for having me here tonight. It is quite an honor to be here with all of you, and especially to be here to celebrate such an exceptional scholar historian as Professor Bournoutian is. I am a Yerevansi, and coincidentally, I was asked to talk about Professor Bournoutian's research on the history of the Khanate of Yerevan. Hence, I will invite your attention to how this work was received when it first got published and what role it still plays in understanding the past, the history of the Khanate of Yerevan that sometimes is equated to Eastern Armenia, as well as in analyzing the present developments in this region. As Professor Bournoutian himself has noted, in 1991, Armenians created an Armenian state in the region of the Khanate of Yerevan. In the conclusion of his book on the Khanate, the one that was published in 92, Professor Bournoutian wrote, and I quote, "Ultimately, it is here that the survivors of massacres, deportation, revolutions, and genocide have succeeded in beginning a new chapter in the history of the Armenian people." End quote. As Bedross already mentioned, the recent 44-day war between Armenia and Azerbaijan, the Russian-brokered ceasefire agreement signed in November, Turkey's support to Azerbaijan, the deployment of peacekeeping forces, and the mass exodus of tens of thousands of refugees to Armenia have raised a number of questions. What political, economic, and strategic interests do the world powers have in the South Caucasus? What role did the regional powers, Russia, Turkey, Iran, play in the escalation or de-escalation of this conflict? And how can we understand the historical context of these complex and multi-layered relationships among the states and the peoples of the region? Professor Bournoutian's tremendous body of research allows us to look at the past of the South Caucasus in its intricate details and opens the door to understanding Transcaucasia in its past relationships with the local imperial powers, as well as in the larger context of the Great Game, and draw some conclusions about the present geopolitical interests of the Western and regional powers. His study also provides enormous details about the various ethnic religious groups of the region and does it based on his analysis of Armenian, Russian, Persian sources, among others. No wonder when his first book, Eastern Armenia in the Last Decades of Persian Rule from 1807 to 1828, based on his dissertation research, got published in 1982, a number of peer-reviewed journals, prestigious journals, included amazing reviews of this groundbreaking study. If you look at these lists of reviews, from Middle East Journal, Journal of Iranian Studies, to Slavonic and East European Review, scholars, historians of Ottoman studies, Iranian studies, Russian and East European studies were emphasizing how crucially important Professor Bournoutian's work was. In his review for the journal Iranian Studies, Professor Rudy Lindner of University of Michigan wrote, and I quote, "This is quite frankly a book for all readers of this review to own," end quote. He then went on describing how many particular questions found answers in this book by attributing that to Professor Bournoutian's diligence and care in the production of his study. After all, when you look at the book, you can find such interesting details about the Khanate of Yerevan that one might not expect to see in a history book, such as average monthly temperature in the Khanate, in the city of Yerevan, detailed lists of buildings, stores, mosques, churches in Yerevan. It's as if he's taking you to the Khanate of Yerevan at that point of time. British historian Malcolm Yapp of University of London described Bournoutian's book as, and I quote, "an exhaustive examination of political, social, and economic life in Eastern Armenia," by emphasizing how Bournoutian employed an extraordinary and dazzling array of Russian, Armenian, and Persian sources. And indeed, some of those sources, I won't manage to mention, of course, all of them, but included such surveys. For instance, Камеральное описание Армянской области, the statistical survey of Armenian province, which was prepared by Ivan Chopin, or the Persian Divan records that provide important information on population, taxation, administration of the Khanate. But a major theme in all these discussions and reviews of Professor Bournoutian's work, of course, focused on his argument that the last Persian administration in Khanate of Yerevan had emerged as far more competent and tolerant than the Russian government that came to replace it. Professor Bournoutian held that Armenians in the last years of Persian rule did not fare poorly in the Khanate, that Armenians in the towns dominated the most important professions and trades. And by the way, he included the list of all those trades and professions in the book. Or that peasant Armenians owned livestock and lived on fertile land. And that the Armenian church enjoyed greater freedom in the last decades of Persian rule than it would under the Russian government. You see, growing up in post-Soviet Yerevan and studying Armenian history in school and later in college, I remember vividly how our teachers taught us this segment of history. The Russo-Turkish and Russo-Persian wars of early 19th century were very important topics. And since we had a very diligent history teacher, we had to study them in details. What did that mean? Well, we had to memorize all the dates, names, developments during each battle, negotiation. The list of those treaties of Bucharest, Gulistan, Turkmenchai, etc. was like a poem embedded in our memory, and you could wake me up, or for that matter, any of my peers in the middle of the night, and we would recite all of those details. Yet, what was missing from that picture was the analysis and discussion. We were taught that the importance of 1828 Treaty of Turkmenchai was that Eastern Armenia finally was liberated from Persian Muslim rule, and Armenians could join the Christian patron Russian Empire. So we knew that Persian rulers were not as bad as Ottomans, and we would be also reminded that Iran was Armenia's friend, but Muslim rule was unacceptable and unbearable for all Armenians. Thus, Paskevich was the savior of Armenians. We never questioned these statements, never discussed the nuances or consequences in critical, analytical manner. There was one truth. Those were the facts. What was there to question? Any such attempt would turn the student into a Vasak Sunni in the eyes of the rest of the students and teacher representing the clan of righteous Mamikonians and defending the honor of the history textbooks, and with that honor of all Armenians. And this was the situation in classroom in early 2000s in Yerevan. While in the 80s, with his work, Professor Bournoutian had already challenged this historiography. Indeed, he kept doing that afterwards, right? Professor Bournoutian kept working on this subject following the publication of his first book. 10 years later, he published a revised and more expanded version of it, titled The Khanate of Yerevan under Qajar rule, 1795 to 1828, a much more preferable title for the author. Late Dr. Vartan Gregorian, then the president of Brown University, wrote the review of this publication in the International Journal of Middle East Studies, where he called this volume an outstanding work. Dr. Gregorian wrote, and I quote, "His, Professor Bournoutian's, familiarity with Soviet historiography and the historiographies of the various Transcaucasian nationalities, combined with his intimate knowledge of Iranian and Armenian history and historiography, has prevented him from being an unsuspecting advocate and has instead allowed him to be an objective observer and historian. The result is a model study of the Transcaucasian provinces before the advent of Russian rule, a region and a period other historians have shied away from." End quote. I picked late Dr. Gregorian's words to conclude my part, since he was the one who became the reason our paths with Professor Bournoutian crossed. First time we actually talked to each other after I had just received Vartan Gregorian scholarship for my research on Russian imperial humanitarianism in Transcaucasia. Professor Bournoutian shared the secret with me that as a member of the distinguished jury evaluating our scholarship applications, he had noticed that there was a proposal on Russian Empire and Armenians, and he thought it was promising. I was incredibly humbled and honored by that, and I am immensely grateful for your support, Professor Bournoutian. I will stop here, and the stage is yours, Stephen. Bedross, you're muted.
Okay, thank you very much, Dr. Darbinyan. Can you hear me now? Last but not least, our final speaker is Dr. Professor Stefan Badalyan Riegg. He's an assistant professor of history at the Texas A&M University. He's the author of the book, Russia's Entangled Embrace, The Tsarist Empire and the Armenians, 1801-1914. Dr. Riegg is currently working on a book project entitled The Experimental Empire, Russian Imperialism and the Western Expatriates in the Caucasus, which reconsiders the story of Romanov imperialism in the Caucasus by uncovering Russia's trial and error strategy of transplanting or tolerating the settlement of Western European communities in its strategically vital borderlands. The protagonists include Scottish missionaries, French silk barons, German schismatic colonists, British oil speculators, Swiss evangelicals, and the Russian bureaucrats who monitored them. This study examines the often conflicting Russian perceptions of quote-unquote foreign and quote-unquote Western life in what the state portrayed as the most prized quote-unquote Eastern periphery. We are looking forward to this coming book or your project, Stefan, and the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Dr. Matossian. Dr. Bournoutian, congratulations. It is an absolute honor to be here. It is an honor to participate on this all-star panel with Dr. Aslanian and Dr. Darbinyan. Like Dr. Darbinyan, I reached out to Dr. Bournoutian years ago when I was a graduate student towards the start of my dissertation project at UNC Chapel Hill, probably more than a decade ago. I emailed him after I discovered his incredible body of scholarship, specifically on the theme of Russian imperialism in the South Caucasus. And I already knew that I wanted to write on Romanov, Eastern Armenian political ties. And it became very obvious very quickly after just a cursory search when I was starting out that Dr. Bournoutian's body of work was going to be towards the top of the pyramid that I needed to consult. As soon as I emailed him, I was green, just out of college. I knew no one. I knew nothing about the field. I knew nothing about the history. I didn't even know the word historiography probably at the time. Dr. Bournoutian immediately sent help, guided me, sent tips, advice, and it is a real pleasure to see his latest work, about which I'm going to talk at the end of my presentation today. Glancing at the titles of Dr. Bournoutian's 30 plus, can you think about that for a second? Just think about that number, 30 plus books. His CV has 2 pages of books on it. Glancing at the titles of Dr. Bournoutian's 30 plus books, we see several themes emerge. One of the more prominent is Russian expansion into the South Caucasus in the first half of the 1800s, the first half of the 19th century. I think specifically the first 2 or 3 decades have attracted Dr. Bournoutian's attention quite a bit over the past couple of decades. He has contributed so much to our knowledge of Russian imperialism in the first decades of the 19th century, that it would not be possible, nor would it make sense for me to cover all of it in the 10 minutes I have. Instead, I will highlight some key observations. First, I want to emphasize something that Dr. Aslanian and Dr. Darbinyan have already mentioned. There is going to be inevitably, I think, some overlap here in our comments. Dr. Bournoutian has translated, edited, or assembled several valuable collections of rare primary sources that elucidate various aspects of the Russian administrative, social, political, and military machinery in the South Caucasus. From my perspective, in my opinion, that has been one of his key contributions to our understanding of the tangible Russian methods of expansionism in the South Caucasus, because all of his work is so meticulously researched, and he has a real emphasis on the nuts and bolts of imperialism, on the gritty details of bureaucracies, of militaries, of politics. We gain a much more tangible sense of Russian methods of imperialism and annexation. Let me give you a couple of specific examples here. His 2011 volume on the Russian survey of Karabakh in 1823, is valuable not only for giving us a glimpse of how Russian officials encountered that important corner of the South Caucasus, but it also presented irrefutable evidence for the presence of Armenians in that region well before the formal annexation of Karabakh in 1828. This is a really important document, a really important work of scholarship, because as I think most people, everyone perhaps in this audience understands, there's a lot of current political, socio-political, socio-ethnic tension and pressure on this question about the genesis of the Armenian presence in Karabakh. Dr. Bournoutian's 2011 volume, The Russian Survey of Karabakh, coming from an ostensibly, at first, disinterested Russian perspective, is a really important contribution to bringing specific tangible evidence for Armenians having been there way before the post-Turkmenchai relocation took place, the 40,000 or so. Overall, Dr. Bournoutian's primary source collections, including Armenians and Russia, a documentary record 1626-1796, published in 2001, are invaluable resources for researchers of different, distinct stripes and interests and backgrounds. One of the reasons that book of his, Armenians and Russia documentary record, is so important is that he translated, as Dr. Aslanian mentioned, something like 2,000 documents into English that had previously been completely unavailable to anyone who did not speak or read Russian. So it's an invaluable resource for researchers from other fields, perhaps other subfields, who don't have access to the Russian archives, and perhaps more importantly, who don't have access to the Russian language. Second, I want to point out that Dr. Bournoutian has persuasively challenged the prevailing Russian language historiography. I think that has been really one of the several key foci he has had in terms of historiographical debates in his work for many years, 30 plus years. I think he has been really focused on correcting the errors of Soviet era, both Armenian and Russian scholarship in Russian. In his 1992 book, The Khanate of Yerevan under Shah rule, he demonstrated that elite Armenians in the Khanate, particularly merchants, enjoyed significant social privileges from the Khans and other Persian leaders. This was an important contribution that really contradicted the body of scholarship produced during the Soviet era that was driven by the Marxists, the Stalinists, really trope of friendship of the peoples, Дружба народов. Contrary to the attestations of contemporary Russian officials, contemporary, I mean 19th century Russian officials, and Soviet era scholars, both, again, to be clear, both Russian and Armenian, Abbas Mirza and Hossein Qoli Khan Bajar were more interested and had more reasons to keep their Armenian subjects content than to oppress and exploit them. Thus, we gained a valuable corrective to the Soviet era historiographical emphasis on the universal Armenian opposition to Persian rule and supposedly desperate, blind almost allegiance to Russians. This had been an emphasis in even some early post-Soviet Western scholarship that had just started to write on the South Caucasus, on Romanov expansionism into the region. And before they could get out to the slowly opening archives, they were using some of the Russian language works published in the 1960s, 1970s, 1980s. In the 1970s, at the 150-year anniversary of Turkmenchai, there was a huge explosion of Soviet-era scholarship on Romanov imperialism. And well into the 1990s, people writing in English using Russian secondary sources were making this mistake. And it is thanks to Dr. Bournoutian that we gained a valuable corrective that, of course, was very quickly integrated into the prevailing scholarship, cited all the time, and really has given us a more nuanced, a more sophisticated portrayal of Russian expansion. Yes, the Armenians still were very overwhelmingly in favor of Russian annexation, but Bournoutian has added the type of nuanced, textured analysis to that narrative that was sorely missing. Third, I want to say a few words about Dr. Bournoutian's latest book, From the Kur to Aras, a military history of Russia's move into the South Caucasus and the First Russo-Iranian War. I just finished reading it. I'm so happy I was able to finish it in time for today's presentation. I received it recently and couldn't wait to get my hands on it. This book is a blow-by-blow military history of that conflict's every shot, every ambush, and every encounter from 1801 to 1813. To my knowledge, no other scholar, at least writing in English or Russian, I'm pretty certain about that, has examined this conflict in such detail. It's incredible the degree to which he zooms in on the specific aspects of this inter-imperial struggle without neglecting or overlooking the people stuck in the middle, more the elites than the ordinary people, but the Khans, the Meliks, the other intermediaries really have a voice in this narrative. Bournoutian meticulously documents every armed unit, every movement, every skirmish and tense debate between the two combatants and among the various allies. One of the book's key strengths is the illustration of how and why each Khan of the South Caucasus vacillated between the Russian and Iranian sphere. I think that's an absolutely fascinating part of this book, and something that is truly, from my perspective, my knowledge, truly unique. The degree to which other people have mentioned the vacillation of the Khans, but not to this degree. Thanks to Bournoutian's use of select Iranian sources to complement his mainly Russian documents, we'll learn how the Khans, at once frightened, desperate, and opportunistic, played the Tsar and the Shah off each other to maintain their prerogatives or to benefit from their neighbors' defeats. The representatives of the two emperors, meanwhile, cycled through promises and threats to secure the collaboration of the encircled Khans. If you haven't had a chance to read the book yet, check it out just for the sake of reading all of the incredible, sometimes absurd, occasionally comical, but always ridiculous threats from the very condescending, very Orientalist, ethnic Georgian commander of the Russian army in the early 1800s, Pavel Tsitsyanov. The quotes are absolutely incredible. So I want to wrap up by saying that thanks to Dr. Bournoutian's prolific career, we have gained a thorough understanding of the pivotal chapters of Russia's penetration into the South Caucasus in the early 19th century. From my perspective, that has been a truly unique, truly important contribution, something that I have used heavily in my book, something that other scholars are continuing to use, and I have no doubt will continue to use when they discuss Russia's engagement with both the Persians and the Ottomans in the early 19th century. His research has shed light on the minute details of Tsarist aims, actors, processes, and results that permanently reshaped the geopolitical borders of the South Caucasus. Scholars of Russian imperialism owe much to his work. Thank you very much, Dr. Bournoutian.
Thank you very much, Stephen. And this has been a fascinating panel, a testimony of Professor Bournoutian's contribution to the field of not only Armenian studies, Russian studies, Iranian studies, Caucasian studies. Just a few words, this event was supposed to be an event that was going to take place in May, last May in New York, but due to COVID, we had to cancel it, and everything is virtual now. And we're lucky that we were able to hold this event virtually. We have already sent the award to Professor Bournoutian, the Lifetime Achievement Award. Can you show it, Professor Bournoutian, closer to the camera, please, for his contribution, recognition for his contribution to the field of Armenian studies. It's a major achievement, and we're very proud of you, of your decades of commitment in advancing the field of Armenian studies. And now, last but not least, Professor Bournoutian is going to say a few words about his career, life in academia, and his contribution. And so, floor is yours, Professor Bournoutian.
First, I want to thank you, Bedross, for arranging this honor and for arranging three great speakers who have read my books. I know I give my books to some people, and as Sebouh will tell you, some people have my books, but they are really in the library. They bought it because they want, well, George will buy your book. Fine, buying my book does not, first, we don't get any money, as you scholars know. It's very important. I'm very humbled. I have never been praised so much by anyone, especially by three people who know their subject. So I really thank you. One of the main reasons I translated the early works, Sebouh, was mainly because American scholars like Rudy Matthew, whom I met in conferences, and others like William Floor, could not read Armenian. And they knew there were a lot of Armenian sources. So they kept on saying, why don't you translate it? The main reason was not for Armenians. I know Sebouh does not need me to translate Jumper. He can read Jumper in the original. He can read the Simeon Lehatzi in the original. They were not for really those Armenian scholars who knew Armenian. It was mainly for non-Armenian scholars who were interested in this area. And some modern younger Armenian scholars also who are in different fields do not read Armenian well, especially American Armenian scholars. So not all of